This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Well, thank you for tuning in this week's NC Spin. In these dog days of summer, we want relief from the heat, escape from COVID-19, and perhaps a getaway vacation. But with just a little over 3 months before the vote, NC Spin thinks it's time to start thinking about the 2020 elections, and we have two of our state's leading political scientists joining us to give insights into the candidates and the issues. They include Dr. Michael Bitzer, professor of politics at Catawba College, Old North State Politics blog also head, Susan Roberts, a professor of political science at Davidson College. And joining our panel this week also are Chris Fitzsimon, director of the state's Newsroom, and John Hood, syndicated columnist and author. We'll begin our uninterrupted discussions after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
We're going to go down the list of major state elections, but before we do, let's set the stage for this November 3rd vote. When we began 2020, we anticipated this was going to be the headline event for the year, but the coronavirus changed all that. Michael Bitzer, what impact has the virus had on the campaigns? Are people even paying attention to these elections?
I think people are paying attention. If you look across the polls, there are very few undecideds now at the end of July, early August. And I do think COVID-19 has, for lack of a better term, infected everything. You're looking at job approval ratings of politicians. You're looking at candidates, how they're reacting to the responses. I think COVID-19 will continue not just to affect the campaigns and the candidates, but also the voters in terms of thinking about how they're going to vote this November 3rd.
Susan Roberts, we said from the get-go this election was going to be all about Trump, and every race, one way or another, would be affected by Trump. Is that still the case?
Oh, I think it is. And if you look at the 2018 midterms, those are usually a referendum on the president, and he got a resounding, as George Bush used to say, a thumping. And I think that if you look at Trump, he was a novelty in 2016. He's not a novelty anymore. And so I think people are going to look to the past and make a decision about where Trump is taking them and where they need to go. And I think the coronavirus has changed the campaigning, and Trump can't feed off the people.
Chris, we've often said that the urban counties and some of the suburban counties are turning bluer and bluer, Democrats, and the rural counties are more and more red, Republican. Is this going to hold in this election?
Well, I think it, as a rule, probably holds, but I think this is unlike any election in any of our lifetimes. And in some ways, I was talking to somebody this week who said this election is really not even about philosophy as much anymore as it is competency. And I think people have, we've talked about the coronavirus already, realized that there is no federal plan, there is no federal leadership. We get mixed messages all the time. And the vast majority of people around the country are still worried, scared, trying to figure out what's actually happening. Are they at risk? Are their families at risk? And what they see is a federal government and a president sort of completely out of touch and changing his mind every day. And I think the word novelty is a really good one. That was sort of funny a couple years ago or 4 years ago. Now it's deadly. And I think that's what you're seeing all the way down the ballot.
John, there are 20 counties in North Carolina that can swing the vote, the popular vote, electoral vote. And most of those 20 counties are urban counties or suburban counties for sure. Is this bad news for Republicans?
Not really. Every vote counts exactly the same regardless of where somebody lives. Lots of the counties that you mentioned actually are Republican counties. They are the counties that surround the urban core counties like Mecklenburg and Wake. and Guilford. So the Republicans, to the extent that they have a chance in winning races this year, it will be largely because not only do they win votes in rural areas, but they also win, again, as do Democrats, hundreds of thousands of votes in these urban centers and the surrounding suburban counties.
Michael, we've had a lot of people register to vote since the beginning of 2020. Tell us how many, tell us who they are and where they are registering, where they come from.
Well, right now we're back over 7 million registered voters. It's been increasing until mid-March, really, when the numbers just kind of dropped and plateaued down. But we're starting to see some pickup back up. We've got now 36% registered Democrats, 33% registered unaffiliated, and 30% registered Republicans. The fastest growing group are those voters under the age of 40, that's millennials and now Gen Zs, and they are driving the registration of unaffiliateds in this state.
Wow. Any notes so far as whether they are urban or rural or where they come from?
Well, the dynamics are very much as you point out. Only 21% of the state's registered voters are in rural counties. And typically what we tend to see is 50% of the votes will come from either 11 or 12 counties out of the 100 across the state. Wow. So again, that urban dominance, along with the fact, as John pointed out, of the surrounding Republican suburban counties is really the dynamic I'm going to be watching closely this fall.
Susan, we've been seeing an increasingly large number of polls being taken in North Carolina. I think part of the reason for that is that we are considered a swing state in the presidential election, and we'll talk about that in a minute. We've been saying prior to this time that it's too early to be taking too much meaning from these polls. Do they count now? Should we start noticing the polls?
Sure. I think we should look at the polls, but be a little wary. I'm looking at something about the Hagen-Tillis race for the Old North State blog, and you really did see the polls careening. Hagen had a lead, just like Cunningham has a lead, but will that last? I think we've gotten over that 2016 kind of hangover. Polls are wrong. You can't trust them. And I think now when we look at the numbers, people have to say, where is this trending?
Yeah. I don't think there's any question about it. Is it too early to ask you about projected turnout? I want all of you very quickly around the horn. Tell me what your projected turnout is. How much of that's going to come from absentee mail-in ballots? Michael, I'll start with you.
Well, that's the great unknown. In 2016, we had 69% registered voter turnout. I could easily see it hitting 70%. Some estimates could see us at 5 million votes. What the distribution is in terms of absentee by mail voting, I have no idea. It was 5% in 2016.
All right, quicker
it ain't
answers.
going to be 5%.
I need quicker answers here. Susan, what's the turnout going to be? Where's it going to come? How much mail is it?
Oh, I think it's going to be very high, and I think you look at motivation. You look at the motivation from George Floyd, and you look at recently the motivation, the pleas to vote from John Lewis.
All right.
And I think if you look at that.
Chris.
Oh, I think it'll be high. It could approach records. I think in terms of the numbers of mail-in or absentee ballots, I think a lot of people are requesting absentee ballots, but they don't have to use them. I think they're worried about what's going to be happening then. Right. So I think it's too early to tell and draw a conclusion from all the requests.
John, turnout. Mail-in.
I think it'll be approximately the same as 2016, and I think mail-in ballots will be somewhere roughly a fifth of the total votes cast.
Let's move to the presidential election. In 2016, Donald Trump won North Carolina's presidential vote by 3.5 percentage points. Now, the polls show our state is in play. Some recent polls have Joe Biden slightly ahead. There's several must-win states for Trump to win re-election. Many say North Carolina is one of them. Chris, agree or disagree?
I don't think it's necessary for Trump to win North Carolina, but if he loses North Carolina, I think it's part of a larger trend. I actually think the trends, speaking of trends, are terrible for Trump and the Republicans. Most polls, most average of polls have Biden up. The question is just how many. The scary thing must be for him when they look at Florida, where he's significantly behind. If he loses Florida, it's all but over, no matter what happens in North Carolina.
Susan, there are a tremendous number of anti-Trump groups. I'm thinking about the Lincoln Project. I'm thinking about the group that just announced this week they're going to be having their own convention in Charlotte at the same time the Republican Party is. How big a factor is this anti-Trump movement going to be?
Oh, I think it's tremendous. We had Bill Crystal here for a semester teaching a seminar, and he was very eloquent about the anti-Trumpers, the never-Trumpers. And I think if you look at the range of people that are never-Trumpers, they're not just the intellectuals. And I think that has an impact. I think they're going to the protest or what have you in Charlotte at the non-convention convention is evidence of that in this state and nationally.
Yeah. Michael, other than President Obama, no Democrat has won this state since Jimmy Carter back in the 90s. You've been studying this very closely. What does Biden have to do to win?
I think certainly Biden has to continue to show a level of competence of how he would approach things, but also not be so to the left that it scares off the moderate middle of North Carolina. I think it is still very much a swing state, but based on the moderates that can decide it, a decreasing number as we get to November, but that number can sway the election one way or the other.
Yeah, John, I was going to ask you at this moment, is it too early to make a prediction on this race?
Of course not. Everybody's making a prediction in the race. I would say, though, well, I didn't say it was be accurate predictions, but people are predicting constantly. I think the race in North Carolina, as in most states, will actually tighten as hardcore partisans and partisan leaners sort of come back home. I'm not arguing that Trump will win. I'm just saying I'm still not persuaded that there is a radical change in the two-party dynamic and the commitments from both sides. We've just become a much more partisan electorate than we used to be. The number of swing voters is fairly small. Maybe it'll go up some. I don't know, but I don't think it's going to go up a tremendous amount.
Let's move to the U.S. Senate race. This is the first re-election campaign for Senator Thom Tillis. Most everybody admits he's got problems. He's not conservative enough for a lot of Republicans, too close to Trump for many unaffiliateds and Democrats, doesn't have an outstanding track record, hasn't been particularly visible in North Carolina. Polls have shown him running behind pretty consistency, except a Cardinal poll this past week shows him ahead of Cal Cunningham. Cunningham is definitely outraising him. Michael, what's your assessment of this race?
I think, like John said, everything is going to tighten up, as Susan indicated as well. These will be competitive-driven elections down the ballot, and it will oftentimes be driven by the top of the ticket. How Donald Trump potentially performs in North Carolina will determine a lot of how things play out down the ballot.
That was going to be my question. He's tied himself to the coattails of President Trump for a long time. How big a factor is this going to be? Chris, this week the gloves came off in this race. We saw Tillis and Cunningham making all kinds of accusations. Cunningham criticizing Tillis for the federal tax cut of 2017, saying it benefited only the rich and corporations. Tillis, on the other hand, complaining about Cunningham raising taxes in the 2001 legislative session. Is it going to get nastier?
Oh, yeah. We're just beginning, I think. Not only will it be nastier from the candidates, it'll be far nastier from outside groups on both sides. We say this a lot, and it depends on how things go around the country. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not necessary that Trump wins North Carolina to win re-election or whatever. I think will play a big role. But it might be actually determined the control of the U.S. Senate conceivably could lie in who wins the Senate race. So you're going to see an inordinate amount of outside spending on both sides. I think it is clear that Cunningham is ahead now in virtually every poll, and the average of the polls, even the sort of the conservative aggregators, I think put Cunningham up a handful of points. But this will be very close, I think, as we get towards November.
Let's move to the governor's race. Roy Cooper defeated Pat McCrory by 10,000 votes in 2016. Lieutenant Governor Dan Forrest has been running since 2016. Hadn't gotten a whole lot of coverage. John, is this going to be an election, a referendum on Cooper's handling the coronavirus, or will there be other issues?
There are other issues, but the coronavirus, as we said at the top of the show, is the number one issue on people's minds. It's the number one issue probably that people are now attached to Roy Cooper. We've debated and argued for years about all the different other things that have happened, the school funding fights, and there wasn't a state budget renewed for years. We were operating on a 2-year-old budget, all that kind of thing. That's all way in the rearview mirror at this point, and this has largely become a coronavirus election. We'll have to see how that affects Cooper, but we know how it affects Dan Forrest. It makes it hard to see him because
Yes.
he's not making decisions on a daily basis and having press conferences and getting all the attention. So
Not getting a lot of airtime.
So that's just the reality of the situation.
Yeah. Susan, Roy Cooper has vetoed more bills than all other governors we've had in this state collectively. And up until the last couple of years, those vetoes have been overridden by the legislature. How big a factor are these vetoes going to be? I know we're going to hear a lot about it during the campaign. How big a factor do you think it's going to be with the voter?
I don't think it'll be much of a factor at all. And I mean, I hate to say that unequivocally, but I think people will look at Cooper and say he was reasonable, he is compassionate, and people are looking for that in a leader. But you have to say that this is the time with coronavirus that the public, and not just North Carolina, they're looking down ballot. What if we had, instead of the coattail effect going down, what if we had an up ballot in which Cooper could deliver more in terms of who gets the nod from North Carolina? So I think at this time, which is unprecedented, we're going to see Cooper really shine. He made the right decision, as or the correct decision when we looked at what happened to Florida. He was, the foresight was very smart, and he was very reasonable in how he approached the situation.
Polls to this point, as Chris said, Michael, show Cooper ahead. Is coronavirus going to be the litmus test for him?
I think it is, just simply because he is the chief executive, as John noted. He's the one leading the state through it on a day-to-day basis. And I think that really plays well. I think if you look at other governors who have taken similar approaches as Cooper has, their approval ratings tend to be higher. For those governors who haven't really been engaged, Texas, Georgia, Florida, their numbers have been dropping to around where Trump's numbers are.
Let's move to the lieutenant governor's race. We've got an unusual race there. Mark Robinson is only the second African-American Republican to run statewide. Basically unknown. He surprised a whole lot of people with that gun rights video he recorded that won the primary for him over some better-known candidates. He's going to be facing Representative Yvonne Lewis Holley from Wake County. There's only been one other case of an African-American elected statewide. That was Democrat Ralph Campbell. Handicap this race for us, John.
Well, you mean a non-judicial candidate. We've had statewide judges.
You're right. Yeah.
But what I would say about this race is very difficult for voters to learn much about. It will probably follow the other trends. I think, as we said earlier, the Cooper story might be different. It might be that Cooper gets a higher percentage of the vote than other Democratic candidates, or it could be a reverse coattail effect. But the uncertainty that has to do with the schools, this is the fundamental question that we don't know about, and whether this affects the lieutenant governor's race, because the two candidates have been talking about reopening schools. It affects Cooper. The reopening of the schools is the big uncertainty here that could still affect Democratic candidates like Cooper and the lieutenant governor candidate, Lewis Holley.
Yeah, and Susan, we're going to have an African-American as our lieutenant governor, one way or the other in this. Both of them been having trouble raising money, though.
Well, I think that's true, and I think that it makes it sometimes when you look at campaigning during the coronavirus, at what point is it unseemly to make a lot of appeals? And also, you don't have the really big donor dinner kinds of events. And so people are putting their money pretty much at the top of the ticket. And so I think this is going to be a race that would benefit from a lot of publicity and free airtime. I just think it's going to be difficult
to get that airtime.
Yeah, get the airtime and look at down ballot. It's going to be an air war and not a ground war.
I think you're right about that. Let's move down ballot to some of the other Council of State races, and I want to particularly look at some of them that might be more interesting. We've got a vacant seat in the Superintendent of Public Instruction's race. Kathy Truitt, an education advisor to Governor Pat McCrory, won the Republican nomination. Jen Mangum, a UNCG professor endorsed by the NCAE, is the Democrat and won over four other candidates. Michael, we hadn't heard a whole lot from this race. Any news on it? Handicap it for us.
We really haven't, but as John indicated, the schools issue is going to be driving it. And so I think the candidates are going to be focused on that issue about how schools deal with COVID-19 and coronavirus. I think at this point, for all the down ballot, particularly Council of State, it's going to be about party identification and party loyalty. That's what's going to primarily drive it, because the party labels provide cues to voters. If they haven't recognized the name, they don't know the candidate, they're going with the party affiliation.
We've had a war between the State Board of Education and the current Commissioner of Public Instruction, Superintendent of Public Instruction. Chris, is that going to be a factor?
Well, I think it'll be a factor for the sort of education community, but I don't think in the larger populace, given all that's going on, it's probably not going to be as big a factor. I wanted to get quickly, if I could, back to the lieutenant governor's race. The Republican candidate in this race has views far outside North Carolina's mainstream and the Republican mainstream. I actually think he's probably hoping that the race doesn't get a lot of attention and he can ride some coattails if things turns around nationally, because he might be the most extreme person that has been nominated for statewide office.
And
it might end
up being a situation kind of like we talked about before. Trump's coattails might make a difference on that. Another vacant seat is the Commissioner of Labor seat. Democrat Jessica Holmes, a Wake County commissioner, is running against Republican Josh Dobson, a representative in the North Carolina House. John, any noise coming from this race? Who's favored?
Not a whole lot. I would say that because Holmes is from Wake County, which is a vote-rich area, she has a lot more people who have ever voted for her than Dobson does. But that's about all you can say about it, because there just hasn't been the resources or the public attention to really make the Department of Labor office. For example, not like the Commissioner of Insurance, which has still gotten a lot of attention because of the scandal and all that sort of thing. There just isn't very much on the labor front.
Yeah, Mike Causey, the current Commissioner of Insurance, is having a rematch against the man he defeated in 2016. We had this big news coming out of the fact that he wore a wire to help convict a big Republican donor who was trying to have influence over the commissioner's office. This is going to be a Wayne Goodwin, Mike Causey race rematch. Susan, any news on that? Any predictions on that?
I really don't. And I think, again, that's going to be the kind of issue that if you look at, as they say, the down ballot or the coattails effect, to sound like a nerdy political scientist, it's usually between 0.2 and 0.5. But if you have a very close race, that's going to make a difference. And I think it comes down to, which I don't know much about, how competitive the race is at this point. And I think that that will be something that people, everything's too crowded. There's no vacation. There's not really a staycation. They're going to look at what they know, and that's top of the ticket.
I would say real quick that I think even if the Republicans have a bad night in November, I still think Mike Causey might be one of the Republicans who still wins, and even in a bad night.
All right, very quickly, any of the other Council of State races that Commissioner of Agriculture, State Treasurer, Secretary of State, any of them that are stirring any interest at this moment?
The State Treasurer's race is the key one.
You think so?
That's another candidate with Dale Falwell, where because he has the state employee endorsement, that possibly could help him in a year, in a cycle that would otherwise be rough for Republicans, if that's what happens.
We're running out of time on the show, but I want to get to the legislature if I can. We'll talk about the House at another time. We're in a situation where the House is in play. In 2018, the Democrats gained enough seats in the House and Senate to attain veto-proof majorities. There's some newly redrawn districts. Democrats think they're favorable. They need to gain 5 seats in the Senate in order to be able to take control of it. Chris, what are their chances?
Well, I think they believe they have a strong chance. I think they have a reasonable chance. There's 2 or 3 seats that I think they will win, barring a big upset. The question is how they get to 25 or 26. They're going to have a continued momentum. I think these cases will be really close. Republicans want to make them all local, of course. The Democrats want to make this a national and statewide election, even for the legislature. Right?
Yeah, Michael, so far as it goes, the House needs to gain 6 in order to be able to get a majority there. What do you think their chances are of making that happen?
I think it's too close to call on either side. It's going to be competitive down to the wire on both chambers, I think.
And what are the impacts, Susan, if the House or the Senate happens to flip? How's that going to affect redistricting in 2021?
Oh, I think it's going to be critical. And I think that if you look at what's going on with the census, there'll be a better push for that. And I think we've got to ask ourselves, what happened in North Carolina, the 9th district, and is that still a bellwether that Republicans, just barely squeaked in? And I think that looking at that has an impact on whether or not North Carolinians can get back to the days of governors, which, pre McCrory, in which it was astounding that a Republican could win as governor.
I don't think there's any question about the fact that these elections have some pretty significant consequences. We hope you've enjoyed this in-depth look at November's elections. Of course, we'll update you as the campaigns unfold. We want to thank Susan Roberts and Michael Bitzer for being with us, and we ask you to visit our website, ncspin.com, for more information all during the week. Until next week, I want to stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Your life is more flexible and efficient than ever, and your energy is too. See how North Carolina's electric cooperatives are building a brighter future for the rural communities we serve at ncelectriccooperatives.com/brighter.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.